The story of the hunter, his companion and the little rabbit. In a small rural village hidden near the edge of a lush forest, with a backdrop of towering hills, covered in a light mist that floats like a large veil of mountains, a clear stream flows through the village. Schools of fish, big and small, swim around freely. Sunlight reflects off the mist on the grass and water, reflecting and sparkling like moving gem. After the rain stopped, it was almost dawn, indicating a new day. The sky was clear and bright, with a light mist over the village. Flocks of birds were flying about, their calls blending with the gentle breeze. The aroma of smoke wafted from a house where breakfast was being cooked. The village looked peaceful, like a living painting. Amidst the quiet of the countryside, the edge of the forest not far away began to whisper softly, as if something was waiting for them. The sky was clear today. In the open field in the middle of the village children were running around happily. Their laughter echoed throughout the fields. Some were skipping stones, others were chasing grasshoppers. A few big dogs were running after the children, joking around happily, their tails wagging as if they were dancing. In the distance, there were piles of hay, which the villagers had collected to feed their animals. A big rooster was perched on a big tree stump, crowing every now and then, as if to announce to everyone that he was the guardian of this place. A small, lively rural village, far from the edge of the forest, at the foot of a mountain, there is a small house standing alone, quite isolated, like the last front line before entering or leaving the forest. The owner of the house is a middle-aged Thai man with a strong, tall body. His right arm is tied with a cloth, wearing an old gray vest. His face is full of a short, gray beard. He smiles dryly, indicating an experienced person. Around his neck, he has a solid boar tusk amulet, shining in the sunlight, symbolizing victory and bravery. His occupation is hunting, farming, and gardening. He lives alone. He has 2 hunting dogs, 1 cat, a rooster, and 3 flocks of hens. Nearby, the same cat, a member of the household, sits quietly on an old tree stump, looking around with eyes that are both indifferent and expectant, as if waiting for orders, or perhaps just waiting for its master to call out to it. Next door, a mother hen brings her little chicks along, pecking and scratching in the dirt for food. Their chirping sounds blend with the chirping of little birds perched on the branches, some flying about in the air as if dancing to welcome the cool morning breeze. Not far away, in the open air, a rooster crowed loudly, and dogs ran and played with each other happily. The hunter stood in front of the house, one hand holding a polished wooden bow, the other stroking an arrow in a quiver strapped to his shoulder. The quiver was made of old animal skin, but as strong as armor. On either side of him were 2 hunting dogs, lean but full of energy, their sharp eyes staring alertly at the forest. Their tails wagged slightly, as if they knew their master was about to take them on another adventure. He took a deep breath and looked out at the edge of the forest, where the light was glistening, and the treetops were shadowed by the sunlight. He put the bow on his shoulder, turned and nodded, and whistled for the dogs to prepare to set off. They got up and ran ahead, knowing where they were taking them. The hunter and his followers traveled for a long time before entering a large forest. The hunter and his 2 hunting dogs stepped into a vast forest that stretched out like a kingdom of nature. Many species of trees stood tall, providing lush shade, spreading their branches over the hills that cascaded down to the horizon. A light mist floated over the treetops, like a huge blanket that hid the secrets of the forest. Grasses grew sparsely on the ground, alternating with ancient tree roots that protruded from the ground like the veins of the forest. The sounds of the forest never cease. Male jungle fowls crow loudly, sharply as if challenging the visitors. Crowds of birds swinging from vines, rhythmically calling for their mates. Birds of all kinds sing in harmony throughout the forest. Some perch on branches and sing, others swoop back and forth. Under the thick shade of leaves, when the sun shines, it shows that this great forest never sleeps, but is full of life that is constantly moving forward. The hunter moved cautiously, weaving through thick underbrush and tangled vines. Sometimes he had to bend low to squeeze through overhanging branches, sometimes he looked up to see footprints and marks on the ground. His sharp eyes scanned for signs of boar footprints buried deep in the damp earth, muddy patches and leaves or warm dung. The dogs walked a short distance ahead, noses close to the ground to smell. Deep in the forest, in a corner of a small pond, surrounded by a mud lick, a herd of wild boars were enjoying themselves in the mud. The big, jet-black leader led the other boars as if they were escaping the heat from the sunlight filtering through the leaves. The clear water in the pond reflected the fluffy clouds in the sky. The lick and the pond were the destinations for wild animals, from deer, barking deer, to tigers that lurked in the shadows. It was a rich hunting ground, and it was well known among hunters that if they wanted to hunt a prominent animal, they had to go to this lick and the pond. The hunter slowed down. The fatigue from the long journey through the forest began to spread through his body. The bow was still in his hand, but the arms that were once tense began to relax. He looked around and saw only sunlight filtering through the shade of the leaves, starting to turn a pale orange. The afternoon sun was slowly sinking, indicating how much time had passed on this journey. He stopped for a moment near a small stream with clear, cool water. He sat down and observed the pool of water, which was full of footprints of various animals, deer, barking deer, and most importantly, large wild boar footprints that were deeply embedded until they were clearly visible. He smiled and stroked his short beard with satisfaction. The hunter stood still for a moment after the sound of a branch breaking. He held the polished bow in his hand, one hand stroking the darts he slung over his back with confidence. His 2 hunting dogs were still alert, ears pricked, noses sniffing the air as they passed through the deep forest. He nodded at them before beginning his stalking, cutting into the heart of the forest. His target was clear, a large wild boar, the prize of the day. The afternoon sun and the leaves swaying in the wind. He had walked long and far enough. Finally, he decided to stop and rest. His eyes glanced at a smooth, suitable-sized rock. He walked over and sat down, placing his bow and quiver beside him. His 2 hunting dogs followed and sat beside him, looking at their master with equally tired eyes, but still alert. The hunter let out a long sigh, held his temples with both hands, and lifted his fingers to rub his eyelids lightly to get rid of the fatigue that was starting to tighten in his eyes. He removed the pale loincloth from his waist to wipe the sweat on his face and neck. The smell of sweat mixed with the smell of the forest was on the tip of his nose. A cool wind blew over the rocks, bringing him a sense of tranquility. The hunter looked at the 2 dogs that were starting to lie down on the ground. He smiled faintly before deciding to lean back against the rocks. He felt relaxed, his tired eyes slowly closing. The sound of the wind blowing through the leaves and the sound of water flowing from the distant stream lulled him to sleep in the silence. The rustling sound of leaves that had been coming from the bushes earlier began to return, softly and gradually becoming clearer. One of the dogs looked up, sniffing the air. Even the sleeping hunter did not know that something was creeping closer to him while he was resting. The hunter fell asleep for a while, exhausted from his long journey in the forest. He had dozed off for a while, but suddenly, the barking of his 2 hunting dogs echoed through the forest, the sharp sound cutting through the silence, waking him up from his sleep immediately. The hunter jolted awake, his drowsy eyes widening. He instinctively grabbed the bough that lay beside him, and in the blink of an eye he slung the quiver back over his shoulder. He leapt up from the rocks and headed in the direction the dogs were barking. The noise was deafening, as if he were facing something hidden in the forest. His body darted through the brush and branches that obstructed his path, his heart pounding with excitement and the hope that this time he might finally find the wild boar he was looking for. The thick bushes on the right, the dogs immediately turned to growl. The hunter raised his bow in a shooting position, his eyes fixed on the spot where the leaves were shaking. His heart beat faster. Something was moving. It might be the big boar he was looking for. He parted the bushes and looked around. It was as he had guessed, the herd of boars were heading towards the waterhole. But suddenly, a snapping sound of a branch behind them made the boars alert, lifting their heads to look around. The hunter frowned and turned to see his dogs, who were already growling softly. Something was moving in the woods, and it might not be just the boars heading towards the waterhole. The hunter stopped his steps, looked through the thick bushes ahead, and searched for the source of the sound. His 2 dogs stood beside him, their tails wagging faster and faster, and they were getting nervous, their noses sniffing the air, as if they had caught the scent of their target not far away. They were waiting intently for orders. The hunter stood up, took a dart from his quiver, and fastened it to his bow. With a quiet gesture, he carefully advanced, following the increasingly distinct footprints. When he reached the spot where the dog was standing, he found a small pool of murky water. The edge of the pool was stained with still damp mud. The smell of earth and water permeated the air. The hunter looked down carefully. There were boar footprints of various sizes buried deep in the mud. Some were large enough to be clearly visible. They must have belonged to the big boar he was looking for. But now, there was no sign of it. The two dogs were still barking and running around the pool, tails wagging excitedly. But their targets had scattered and gone, probably startled by the loud barking that almost shook the forest. The hunter stood still, looking at the footprints with mixed feelings. He was relieved to have found them, and regretful that he had missed his chance. He knelt on one knee by the pool, running his hand over the large, still warm footprints. "Almost there," he said softly to himself, before turning to pat the dogs on the head in consolation. "You did well. I won't miss next time." The sun was beginning to set, leaving only a faint orange glow in the forest. But in the silence that had returned, the distant sound of leaves rustling gently could still be heard, as if something still refused to go away. The hunter stood in front of the pond, looking at the footprints with eyes full of disappointment. He muttered to himself quietly, that wild boar was so close. Regret drove him not to give up immediately. He grabbed his bow again and leapt out, cutting left and right, his feet as fast as the wind blowing through the bushes. His tall body squeezed through the branches and jumped over the rocks. The two dogs followed quickly behind, their tails wagging rhythmically. He followed the footprints and the scent that remained, almost 500 meters away from the waterhole. The forest grew quieter as he went deeper into it. The orange sunlight was fading, leaving only the creeping shadows. The hunter paused, panting. He lifted his sleeve to wipe the sweat that was dripping down his forehead, and he grumbled bitterly in his throat. "Luck is not on our side today. We will not be able to sin," he said as a consolation to himself. He smiled wryly, looking around, where there was not even a shadow of the wild boar. After a while, the hunter let out a long sigh and turned to walk back to the pool from which he had come. His movements slowed down, the exhaustion from the long walk beginning to take its toll. When he reached the pool, he stopped, looked at the murky surface that reflected the faint light of the sky, and whistled a sharp whistle to call to the two dogs that were still running in circles not far away. The whistle echoed throughout the forest. The two dogs looked up, their ears pricked, and ran back to their master obediently. The hunter lightly patted the dogs on the head. "That's all. Let's go back," he said to them as if they were close friends. The bow was slung over his shoulder again, the quiver swaying with his steps. He took one last look into the deep forest before he started his journey back towards the house on the edge of the forest, leaving behind the puddle of water and the tracks of the wild boar. But in the silence, the distant rustling of leaves still faintly resonated, as if the forest was saying goodbye, or perhaps it was a promise to meet again. The hunter and his two dogs walked out of the forest, heading towards the open field that stretched out in front of them. The sunlight was slowly setting below the horizon, turning a deep blue, covered with a shimmering light that filtered through the shadows of the leaves. The distance from this point to the village was about 2 kilometers. The hunter's footsteps slowed down. He took a deep breath, savoring the scent of grass and the cool breeze blowing through the field. Along the way, he caught sight of bushes of wild vegetables growing along the roadside, water mimosa, and water mimosa with lush green leaves. He stopped and picked some of the vegetables and put them into the cloth bag he was carrying. "Even if we don't get a wild boar, at least we'll have something to take back with us," he said to himself with a small smile. The two dogs sat waiting patiently, looking at their master with familiar eyes. After returning for some distance, nearing the village, a dog began to wag its tail excitedly. It circled the hunter, nudging him several times with its wet nose. The hunter frowned in confusion. "What is it, Mist?" he said, looking down. Suddenly, he saw something in its mouth. It was a small rabbit. Soft, gray fur was gently held in its mouth. The hunter quickly knelt down and carefully took the rabbit out of the dog's mouth. He held the rabbit in both hands, looked it over carefully, and found that it was still breathing, trembling but without any serious injuries. "You almost didn't make it," he said softly to it. The little rabbit looked at him with its wide eyes filled with fear. The hunter decided to hold it close to his chest, and turned to pat the dog on the head lightly. "You're really good at bringing it back alive," he chuckled under his breath before standing up and walking on. The two dogs followed behind, their tails wagging proudly. A house on the edge of the forest, located outside the village, began to appear in the distance. The hunter walked with a faint smile. Today, he might not get the big wild boar he had hoped for, but the little rabbit in his arms and the wild vegetables in his bag were gifts from the forest, enough for him to feel that this trip was not in vain. The hunter and his two dogs walked back to their house at the edge of the forest. As the last light of the day faded away, the deep blue sky began to fade into the darkness of night. The atmosphere around the house was quiet, except for the cool wind blowing through the trees and the sound of crickets that began to lull them. The two dogs headed straight for the small basin of water that was placed in front of the house. Their long tongues swished at the water thirstily. After drinking their fill, they both crouched down under the house with their tongues hanging out, gasping for air. They rested with their breaths rhythmically from the exhaustion of a long day. The hunter placed the cloth bag full of wild vegetables on the wooden floor in front of the house. He sat down next to the little rabbit, who was still in his arms, looking at it with gentle eyes. "You will be with us now," he said softly before carefully giving first aid. He used a wet towel to wipe the mud off the rabbit's soft fur, checking its body for any wounds or bruises. Luckily, it looked healthy, just a little startled from what happened in the forest. He placed the rabbit in an old empty chicken coop, took Morning Glory from the bag and put it inside, and placed a small bowl of water for it to drink and recuperate. Mission accomplished, the hunter got up and walked into the house, changing from his clothes stained with dust and sweat from the trek into a simple loincloth wrapped around his waist. He walked outside again, picked up a ladle made from a roughly carved but sturdy coconut shell, and went to scoop up water from a cool clay jar on the porch. He poured the water over his face, washing away the dust and sweat from his skin, then scooped the water down his body, ladle by ladle. The coolness of the water refreshed him, and he could breathe a sigh of relief after a long, tiring day. The hunter stood still for a moment, looking at the chicken coop where the little rabbit had started to move, eating the Morning Glory slowly. He smiled slightly. "Even if we didn't get a wild boar, getting a dog instead wouldn't be bad," he said to himself, before turning to look at the two dogs sleeping soundly under the house. The silence of the night covered the area, with only the moonlight shining down faintly, signaling that the day had come to a complete end. After washing his body, the hunter walked back into the house feeling relaxed. He lit a lantern from the sap of forest trees and headed to the small kitchen corner where there was a clay stove. He started a fire with the firewood he had collected. The sound of wood cracking was heard along with a thin layer of smoke. He picked up the sun-dried fish that had been dried and grilled it on the iron grill, turning it a fragrant brown. Indispensable was the nom-prick number, which he pounded himself from fresh chilies and forest spices, adding a little bit of fermented fish sauce to give it a pungent smell to contrast the spiciness. He placed the plates of Morning Glory, Pack TIW, Pack Samuet, and Pack Crawdon that he had collected along the way next to it and started his dinner. The aroma of grilled fish and chili paste wafted in the air. The two cats and dogs sleeping under the house looked up, sniffed, and then walked closer with their tails wagging. The hunter chuckled softly. "You must be hungry too," he said, dividing the sticky rice mixed with fish into small bowls for the cats and dogs. They bent down to eat with relish. The sound of chewing was crunchy. The hunter sat watching with affection, eating his own rice, dipping it in the wild vegetables with chili paste, and eating the sun-dried fish until he finished the whole plate.
When he was full, he got up and picked up a dry banana leaf, which was neatly folded and sliced, which he kept on the wall in the house. He picked up some dried tobacco and rolled it into a large roll. His thick hands skillfully twisted the banana leaf, lit it with a match, and took a deep drag. Smack, smack! The sound of smoking was heard, along with thick smoke coming out of his mouth and nose. He sat leaning against the wall, looking at the smoke rising into the night sky. The bright moonlight moved through the treetops. His tired eyes slowly relaxed until the tobacco was finished. The hunter got up again, grabbed the white towel draped over the wall, and brushed the wooden floor at the corner of his bed clean. He picked up the old rolled-up mat and shook it, causing dust to fly everywhere before laying it neatly on the floor. He grabbed a large pillow stuffed with dry straw and patted it 2 to 3 times before placing it on the mat. The hunter lay down to sleep. The fatigue from hiking all day slowly relaxed his tense body. Not long after, the sound of a soft "bye" snoring came out, blending in with the sound of the wind and crickets outside the house. Moonlight shone through the cracks in the wooden siding on him and the dog sleeping soundly beneath the house. The little rabbit in the chicken coop stirred slightly before falling back asleep. The house by the forest returned to silence once more, ending a long day with peace and simplicity. The night passed quietly, and a bright new morning entered. The sun shone through the wooden siding of the house by the forest. The sound of birds chirping from the edge of the forest faintly woke the hunter from his slumber. He slowly opened his eyes, got up from the old mat, and let out a long breath to bring freshness back to his body that had rested all night. The snoring sound from last night disappeared, replaced by the vigor of a new day. He put on his old clothes, walked out of the house to do his daily routine as usual, checking the traps around the house, arranging firewood, and preparing water for use. Before the hunter went to the farm, he did not forget to stop by to look at the little rabbit in the old chicken coop. He looked through the wooden slit with a slight smile. The little rabbit looked much more cheerful. Its gray fur was soft and clean. It jumped and danced around in the cage. Its bright eyes were full of life. He picked up the morning glory left over from yesterday and passed it through the cage slit. The rabbit lifted both its front legs close to the cage. It stretched with all its might. Its small mouth bit the morning glory. Club Club made a clear chewing sound, and its ears wagged back and forth. At the same time, the 2 dogs that had just woken up stretched out from under the house. They looked at the rabbit in the cage, groaned "Hing Kloob" in their throats, and ran around the cage excitedly. Its tail wagged nonstop as if it was happy to have a new member in the family. Days passed. The hunter continued to live his life. As for hunting, he only went once in a while. He got used to taking care of every member of the house with care, whether it was scooping water to put in a bowl for the dog, picking scraps of fish for the cat, or picking fresh morning glory for the little rabbit. It grew a little, its gray fur getting fluffier every day. It started to get used to the house by the forest and the chicken coop that became its home. The 2 dogs started to become its regular friends. Every day, they would come and walk around the cage, purring and wagging their tails to make friends. The big-eyed cat would sit and watch from a distance, its eyes cold but full of interest. Sometimes it would walk closer to the cage, moving its whiskers to carefully examine the rabbit. As time passed, the anxiety between the 2 species gradually faded. The 2 dogs stopped barking or growling when they saw the rabbit. They started to sleep near the cage in the afternoon. The cat would sometimes jump up and sleep on the cage, letting the rabbit jump around without any concern. The hunter saw that they were not suspicious of each other. "Looks like you guys are getting along well," he said to himself. A warm feeling spread in his heart when he saw the unexpected friendship. One day, while the hunter was fixing his bow in front of the house, was it because of his carelessness or the dog's frequent scratching at the cage that the cage door opened and the little rabbit, who was curious, slowly climbed out of the cage on its front legs. It jumped back and forth beside the cage. When the two dogs saw this, they yelped and crawled closer to him, wagging their tails. They played and crawled closer to him, wagging their tails. They played with each other, lying close until their nose looking at the three, with a calm expression. The hunter glanced at him and showed both shock and joy, then muttered in his throat, "I can't believe that different species of animals can live together like this." Before getting up to get morning glory for the rabbit and sharing some dried fish with the dog and cat, the house by the forest that was once quiet gradually became full of life, and the hunter felt that the fact that he didn't hunt wild boars that time might be fate that brought these new members to fill his life. He let the rabbit out of the cage, leaving the cage door open, letting it come in and out freely, and never thought of locking it up again. The end. Thank you for following.